Hello and assalamu alaikum. I'm Dr. Khalisah Harris-Shahid, founder of the Islamic Library Association. My work focuses on equitable and accurate Muslim representation in library and literary spaces. In this series, I'm in conversation with educators, authors, and professionals whose work helps shape public understanding, educational access, and the ways communities come to know themselves and others. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Sawsan Jaber, an award-winning educator, author, equity strategist, curriculum designer, and advocate whose work centers inclusion, belonging, student agency, and educational equity. With more than 2 decades of experience in education, Dr. Jaber has worked across classrooms, leadership roles, curriculum development, and teacher preparation programs. Her research and advocacy focus on creating educational spaces where all students feel seen, valued, and empowered, particularly those whose experiences have historically been marginalized or overlooked. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Jaber. How are you doing today?
Walaikum salam. Excited to be in community with you, and I always get so excited when I find like-minded folks.
Alhamdulillah, I thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today. We'd love to get your perception and insight on education and representation. So, what inspired you to dedicate your career to education, and why does this work matter to you personally?
So I think I knew that I wanted to be a teacher as early as 9. I was the first person in my family to graduate, to go to college, to graduate from university, to get my doctorate. And I know that when I told my family that I wanted to be a teacher, there was a lot of sadness and disappointment because culturally, if you weren't a doctor or an engineer, and if you were in the humanities areas, then, humanities were for those who failed. And so for their first child to go to university, they really wanted what they considered something more. Thankfully, alhamdulillah, they realize now the impact of education and that every person in every craft and every field sits in a classroom before they become the expert in that field. And so I always say teachers craft the future of tomorrow in our classrooms every single day. And for me, I think it was like so many different factors. The first time I ever saw myself and felt like I had representation of myself, even though it wasn't an Arab or a Muslim character, was in a book. I felt like I could travel the world from the pages of the books that I was reading, and I loved language. I was writing poetry as early as like 3rd grade, and I think I published my first poem when I was like 10. And so words, writing, it was very healing to me. I also tried to capture the experiences of my family. I come from parents who are refugees of Palestine. And that was really important to me for me to craft and kind of reclaim my own story, even though I didn't know that that was what I was doing at that age, but really just kind of telling my story and leveraging the tools and the mentor texts that I was exposed to do all of that. And so as I grew through school and had more and more experiences where my identity was problematic, even though I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and it was truly the hub of diversity in the 80s and in the 90s, with a massive growing Arab population and Muslim population, there still was a lot of antagonism towards my identities. And so I felt as early as the age of 6, I can recall my first memories in school of teachers who felt like my identity was problematic. And I think all the way through my doctorate, I felt like in different ways and in different spheres and at different antagonism levels, my identity was problematic and that I had to fight to exist and to claim my identity in those spaces. And I never had a teacher who looked like me. Unless I was in an Islamic school and an Islamic environment, I never had a teacher who identified with any part of my intersectional identity, which also made a big difference because I felt like I had a lot of teaching to do as a student for people to understand my perspective and my lived experience.
Mm.
And so I think to me, teaching became something very personal because it allowed me to craft those spaces by design, to really cultivate and think about human-centered spaces where every student not can just really like build a strong self-concept, which is really important to me, regardless of who they are and how they identify, that they see themselves from an asset mindset, particularly after I taught high school for a really long time. And I felt like most of the students who walked into our classroom, once they hit ninth grade, had such a deficit mindset of themselves that we had to often unlearn to relearn and rebuild their
Mm.
self-esteem and to reignite their passion to want to like craft a future for themselves that was different than the socio-political context that was chosen for them. Um, and so that became very personal to me, that we had to like do that work and to be super intentional about doing that and building communities where students got to really understand each other below the surface, right? Like that, where there was radical love that was born out of a deep sense of knowing and understanding each other beyond the surface level markers that we often have, and beyond the single stories that we are exposed to in the media and in other spaces. And so my instruction always centered I was an English teacher, using instructional text and literature to get students to consume content so they can create their own content and share out loud. Public learning was a really big part of my practice in order for us to like really understand each other. And then paying it forward. I always ask my students, now that you know, what will you do with what you know, so that we can ensure that we are doing our civic duty and our kind of public advocacy as global citizens and scholar activists to really push back against dominant narratives about people of color and marginalized communities.
Mm. You mentioned that your identity was problematic. How does representation and belonging impact students, families, and communities, particularly those who may not see themselves reflected in those educational spaces?
So research shows that students who have a deep sense of belonging, like true belonging, not the surface level markers that we usually use to measure what students who belong, how they
Mm.
act and what behaviors they exhibit, but true belonging, students who have a true sense of belonging make 25% higher gains. And when we talk about schools and to schools, we're constantly looking for measurable metrics, right? Not just the social emotional learning part or the human centered piece of it or the healing aspect that classrooms can be to heal so much of the hate that we're seeing in the world today, and so much of the biases that we're seeing against particular groups of people in the world today, that we kind of almost have criminalized and normalized, like, right, the acting on that hate and like the erasure of narratives and all of the things, like where students feel so compelled to assimilate. And so when we talk about metrics, and we're always working to get the metrics, if we use these strategies, we will get this metrics. Well, the true strategy is belonging. And we
Mm.
can't get students to belong if we don't know who they are. And we always talk about like cultural responsiveness. We throw around these big like keywords that people performatively activate in their spaces and then check off of lists. But like my question to teachers when I work with teachers through my consulting and in my keynotes is always, how are you responsive to who you don't really know? Right?
Yes.
So
Mhm.
in order for us to respond through our instruction to students and show flexibility, we need to understand their multiplicity. We need to understand their variability. We need to understand their identities. We need to understand the complexity and nuances of their identities. We need to understand the difference between an immigrant who is a first, like versus a first generation, like the differences between even like Arab students who have been here for a long time, Arab
Mhm.
students who have immigrated, Muslim students who share their intersectionality of being Muslim female and Black versus Muslim female and or Muslim male and Black, or Muslim and Arab, Muslim and Palestinian, a Palestinian versus an Egyptian, like all these different
Mhm.
nuances that
Yes.
really determine how we see the world and how we navigate it and how we walk through it and how we receive people and information based on our lived experiences. We know that that's the research. But unfortunately, so much of that research, with the excuse of like it's too time consuming, right? Like
Mm.
gets kind of brushed away and becomes very performatively enacted in our spaces and doesn't have the impact that it could have when we take time to pause and do it authentically. And then it affects student gains and it affects how students feel. And it doesn't just affect them as far as academics are concerned. Like we want,
Yes.
obviously, as educational institutions, for students to make the most academic gains in our space. But ultimately, if we really want to interrogate the purpose of schools, and we have to wonder what that is, I would hope that the purpose of school is to prepare our children for a future better than the one that we're living in today, and that we can give them the toolbox to craft a future that looks better than the one that we live in today. And so that requires a certain skill set that we didn't need when we were growing up because the world was so different, right? With
Yes.
technology and AI and this dystopia that we're moving towards quicker than we can like blink sometimes. It feels like we're running towards a dystopia. The critical literacy, the interrogation, the ability to notice, name, and interrupt, inequity, all of these different skills become super central. And it's not about anymore, it's no longer about like academic memorization of like what is rhetoric, but the question then becomes, how do we leverage rhetoric to shift and change people's perspectives? How do we use rhetoric in order for us to be civically engaged in the world? Like if we're not shifting the skills and the why we need to teach the kids the skills and being very explicit to understand, to help students understand why these skills are a lifeline for them, then we're failing them. And so much of that really has to play with why it's so important for us to shift our mindsets and really meet this moment in our time, this really tricky, scary moment in our time where we're running towards like more and more harm and kind of criminalization and dehumanization and othering of groups of people in order to push like political agendas that are quite scary.
Hmm. Speaking of othering and even the intersectionality that you've mentioned, uh, we all know that libraries, books, schools, any type of education, whether it's formal or not, they all help shape how people understand themselves and others. What role do these spaces play in building stronger and more inclusive communities?
I'm going to throw that question back at you and say, are they playing a role in building? I always say teaching is a very political act, right? Like we always talk about, people are constantly saying, but we can't talk about all these things because it's too political. And my response is not talking about them is a political choice of power. You're
Mm,
leveraging your power to determine what can and cannot be spoken about in a space, what topics are privileged enough to make it into a classroom and what are not. That is very political. And so when we think about storytelling, I always feel like I run back to Adichie's Danger of a Single Story when she talks about the first
mhm,
time she wrote her own story and she wrote white
mhm,
characters because she couldn't imagine Black characters being in a book because she never read a Black character who looked like her in a book. And how when she published her first book with a Black character, I think it was her professor who told her that he's not authentically African because he wasn't poor and destitute. And that's what an authentic African in his mind was, right? So
mhm,
defining us for us was like crazy concept. And I think it's unfortunate, but even in 2026, so many of our schools still honor canon texts. And I have so many a conversation with teachers about like this perception that the canon texts are the best literature and that BIPOC authors aren't as rigorous
mm,
as white canon authors. And there's this like, I don't know what it is, like this like what's the word I'm looking for? This like devotion, attachment to canon text that doesn't represent so many of our children today as we move towards more than 50% of our children being coming from BIPOC marginalized backgrounds. And so that to me is super telling about how hard we're working to really cultivate spaces where students can authentically see themselves in a text. And how I recall the first time I walked into an expo hall at a conference. It was an international conference, and I walked into an expo hall, and there was a pin of a hijabi young girl wearing jeans and a long shirt, and she was just a hijabi. She looked like my daughter. And I
mhm,
had a very somatic reaction. I couldn't stop crying, and this was like 5 years ago. And when I stopped to sit with myself, I was like, why am I like reacting so large to having such big feelings towards a pin? And it occurred to me that it was the first time that I saw accurate representation of myself as an American Muslim. Like she wasn't wearing niqab. Most of our
mhm,
girls don't. She was wearing regular clothing and just had her hijab on and she was smiling. And I thought, how powerful would it have been if I read myself in a book, if I had a teacher speak my story and validate it, right? In a way that
mhm,
was like, yes, this is a story that is valid among the other stories that we're reading and talking about. And I've never had that experience. And so I cannot stress the importance enough of publishing, purchasing, and supporting authors who represent marginalized, minoritized voices in publication so that we can continue to speak to publishers by telling them that these books are in demand and that we want them. But for teachers and for educators, the importance of integrating these stories authentically. And even though we don't have obviously the numbers in comparison to canon texts and other white authored texts, I use picture books in my college classroom, my university classroom. I use picture books in my high school classroom. I use picture books in adult learning when I was meeting with them as a department chair. In every role that I ever was a part of or led in a school setting, I used picture books because there's stories in there and methodologies and grammar and constructs and photos and other things that we can leverage, and themes that are very adult and can be the beginning of many important conversations. But also the more important piece is that we're normalizing that these stories belong in classrooms among other stories, and that
Mm-hmm.
this is a way that we humanize people who have historically been criminalized, is when we show them eating cookies, when we show the grandmother and the child kind of walking together, when we talk about Black Muslim history in ways that doesn't just speak to their oppression, but we talk about the joys of things like quilting, like Jacqueline Woodson's books, and other books like Salah and Eid, where we show the diversity and nuance of Muslim characters who are Arab, non-Arab, who come from different backgrounds. Like, there's just so much that is so misunderstood about identities that are marginalized and the complexities and nuances of those identities. I keep thinking back to, like, I walked into a classroom to evaluate a teacher, and she walked in with, "I'm not your perfect Mexican daughter," and it was a primarily Mexican classroom, and she said, "I chose this book because it represents you all." And the first thing that I wrote down on my paper was, when did one book represent an entire group of students? Right? It's a
Mm-hmm.
flattening of identity. And so, like,
Yes.
these books, the poetry, the short stories, the picture books, all the different kind of texts that we can integrate into a classroom, even if they're short, allow students to see and value the diversity and the complexity of a nuance, even of intersectional identities, that even if I share an identity marker with you, I can be very different. And I often use this example when I'm presenting in front of teachers, that I have two sisters, and sometimes I can't believe we came out of the same woman because we're so different, right? Like, we are so different. We grew up in the same household with the same upbringing, we had many of the same shared lived experiences, but
Mhm.
we are so different. And so for anyone to flatten out our identities would be doing one or two of us an injustice in a classroom setting where we're supposed to be responsive and flexible towards the individual students. And so it just is so important to leverage these texts to normalize conversations about these topics, and to show the beauty and complexities and the nuances and all the things about different groups of people, and to normalize too that we need to constantly question and interrogate and have conversations with kids too about why these stories haven't made it into classrooms more
Mhm.
prevalently, and why we haven't heard them unless they walk into a classroom with a teacher who really is trying to push the boundaries and expose the kids. Why is it until now that we haven't really normalized seeing these things on a more public and more prevalent scale, and get the
Mhm.
students to wonder and think about what else they don't know, so that they can leave our classroom with a tool of criticality to be able to question and interrogate things as they progress beyond our classrooms.
Mhm. You brought up something very good. It's all very good information, but it's also unfortunate that we have to have this conversation still today. And that you made a very good point about you and your sisters. That's within one household that there's differences. I think every family can recognize within your own children, as when you become an adult, that your children are different. And even though, like you said, they may have been raised the same parents, same household, same all these, and they're still different individuals. So if within one household, even if you're not a part of whatever specific group of people you're talking about, to not recognize diversity or acknowledge nuances within a household, how are you going to flatten an entire group of people? That makes absolutely no sense. And to your point, how you were saying, are we really building within these educational spaces? No, we're not. That's the honest truth. That's why we're talking about this right now. And I think a lot of people sometimes don't recognize the similarities between schools and libraries. They feed off of each other. If schools are not including everyone, welcoming everyone, how are you going to teach them if you don't even know who they are? If who they are is not being discussed within a school setting, or even assignments that are given are not acknowledging different groups of people, then when you come into the library, how are you even going to know what to look for? But instead, the libraries are upholding the very same systems as the average public school. And so, again, like you said, you can have specific teachers that are going above and beyond, or even against the grain. Teachers like that should not be the exception, but the actual rule. And then without you having certain types of representation and experiences as a child, now as an adult, and you've chosen education as your career, throughout your career, what challenges have most shaped your leadership and perspective as an educator?
Boy, that's like a whole I could write a book about this. And I appreciate, like, the correlation between libraries and schools because I feel like, again, it's this concept of normalizing. Like, I speak at a lot of conferences, and a lot of times my intention is to normalize, not that I'm only able to speak about topics that represent my own identity, but that I'm a professional and that I, as a Muslim woman, belong in this space, right? Like,
Mhm.
we need to normalize that we are experts, that we are a part of the American fabric, that what makes this
Yes.
country beautiful and great is the diversity that we represent,
Mhm.
and what we contribute as descendants of immigrants into this country, and all of the histories and ancestors that we bring with us when we enter a space. The challenges of my leadership have really been navigating the landscape as a Muslim, Arab, hijabi female, proving that I belong in this space. One of my students said, "Dr. J, we have to work twice as hard to get half the recognition."
Yeah.
And I think that really hit home. When I was in Dubai, I worked on a national scale to write national standards. And I was in charge of 250 plus schools, training principals to integrate those standards and to implement the Danielson before we even implemented it here in the United States. And it was such a powerful role to be on a national scale doing that work and leading a team with 14 different people from 14 different countries and getting a glimpse into like education on an international scale, and understanding what was happening in these different countries with regards to education. I felt like it was such an enlightening. I never saw myself as anything other than a teacher, and I never thought that I would want to lead because I enjoyed being in the classroom with my students so much. But when I came back from Abu Dhabi, from Dubai, I thought to myself, I can have more impact and I
Mhm.
can be in a space where more people can see me, and we can normalize the fact that I belong in these spaces on a larger scale. And I have so much more to offer. So the first thing I did was I enrolled in my master's degree when I came back, and I finished my master's degree and I started to apply. I became a certified principal. I started to apply for positions and I couldn't get any positions. I did my national board certification, became national board certified. I was awarded my first award. I published my first piece, still couldn't get a job. I think I applied for 26 jobs that summer and didn't even get a single interview. And one of my friends joked and said, change your name to Shannon and see if they'll interview you on your resume if you change your name on the resume. And we read a lot of research on just perceptions of when people see ethnic names on resumes, even if the qualifications are the same, you're less likely to get the job. And so I started my doctorate and I completed my doctorate. And by the time I finished my doctorate, I was awarded 3 more awards, and I published other things. I had published like 3 or 4 other pieces, and one of them was the best journal of the year, academic journal of the year, and all of these different things that were happening in the background. And in my mind, I kept thinking, I have to one up myself. How can I build myself more? How can I make myself more appealing to these places that are not even interviewing me? It was a while before I realized that I wasn't the problem. And that even when I was in those spaces, and even when I started to craft my own pathway and started to consult and eventually became an administrator in a district, that I was having to work so much harder, and really created the sense of double consciousness in my mind, trying to navigate how to say things in a way that we would be palatable to people so that I wouldn't
Mhm.
come off as the angry brown woman, as like this, because I felt an urgency towards the work that I was trying to lead in those spaces. And people around me didn't feel that same urgency because it wasn't impacting them in the same ways. And so there was this like kind of like really weird, I was in a really weird space where here I am being recognized nationally and internationally with 8 awards and publications, and I go to conferences and people know who I am. But in the spaces that I was working, I was struggling to survive because of how I showed up and the things that were
Mm.
important to me. And there just seemed to be a really big disconnect. And so I think part of it was navigating my own identity as a leader in that space, understanding the urgency that our babies were experiencing in the classroom every single day because I'd experienced them too, and so were my children at the same time, and felt like an urgency to shift their experiences and make it better. And I had a layer of people now between me and the students, so the impact to kids was not direct, but my impact to the students was through these adults that I had to impassion to do the work in similar ways. And that was really difficult because there was so much pushback against, and especially post our current presidency, where people felt very emboldened to very explicitly and outwardly say things that were hateful and act on their feelings of hate that were maybe dormant for a longer time because it was politically incorrect, and then it became politically correct, and so they did. And then I think the other part of it too was this like duality of reconciling the fact that I had to really craft my own pathway if I wanted to be heard and wanted to be seen in this landscape with all that I had to offer. In addition to just existing. And when the genocide started 2 years ago, being Palestinian and being a Palestinian advocate really shifted in the landscape as a country also, which made things even more complex and more complicated, even though I've been a Palestinian advocate my entire life. I come from Deir Yassin. If anybody read The Message by Ta-Nehisi Coates, that's my family. I'm the teacher. We've been advocates from day one. And so I think that there was just so much of like this, like, what part of myself is acceptable here? And that made my work with kids even more and more real, because as an adult, I was navigating it. And I was just thinking to myself every time and in every space, if my students are feeling, if I'm feeling this level of antagonism and having to do so much internal work to show up in these very violent educational spaces, and I have the language and I understand where it comes from, what are our babies experiencing and how are they navigating this landscape? And they don't have the language and they don't have the understandings. And it's become so much more violent to target people through social media, through the internet, than it was
Yes.
when I was growing up. Like, we always felt like we were never accepted truly into spaces, but you went home and you closed your door, and you only had to deal with it when you were face to face with somebody who didn't see you as a human.
Mhm.
Nowadays, we don't have to share physical space to share space anymore. And the impact, the social media print and the internet, the print of that stays even beyond time.
Yes.
And so if people want to target you and have the power to do so, it's really easy to do that. And I think I've been the target of many things, and having to navigate that while still trying to grow and survive in academic spaces has been extremely challenging, because I find that I often have to leave myself in different spaces, parts of myself, and then I feel somewhat hypocritical because this is what I tell students not to do, but here I am making those conscious choices in my mind. And so trying to reconcile all of those things and still exist and feel impactful and effective and feel like I can still serve the students in ways that are impactful and effective has probably been the largest challenge, especially as of late. And I think that as time progresses, right, like the experiences shift with what's happening sociopolitically. And in the last few years, and educational spaces have always been violent against
Yes.
BIPOC teachers. That's why there aren't
Mhm.
many of us in the field as it is in
Mhm.
comparison.
Yes.
But that has grown with time. And I think that um, it's just felt more and more antagonistic. And that's why so many people are leaving the field in droves, because it just feels like you can only offer so much when you are struggling yourself to survive some of the violence in these spaces in this moment.
Everything that you're saying, those same feelings and experiences are taking place in the library settings. And I think a lot of people, like I said, just do not connect the two. It's like you can't have one without the other. The violence, not being able to bring your full self, making those decisions on, am I too much of this or too much of that? I need to pull back on this. Or if I say that, and everything is not always blatant. Like you said, the pushback, things like these may have huge impacts or hindrances in these types of settings and spaces when you can't even make the impact and changes that you're striving for. And it proves that a lot of the wording that people use are just words. The intention is not there, the action is not there. We have policy with no true practice, to represent what you're saying your goal is. And these are struggles as adults. So like you're saying, what are the children experiencing?
Right. I think there's also a lot of gatekeeping, right? Like,
Oh,
I've applied for many a position within institutions that I was working in, was never promoted, and it was probably because I wasn't compliant, and I wasn't with like I was pushing back, and that wasn't something that was desirable. Like, so at the end of the day too, like that also the the price that is paid, like you said, sometimes isn't as explicit, but there's definitely prices that are paid. And we can see that with trends on the national landscape altogether, whether it's teachers leaving the field or how many leaders we have, BIPOC leaders in spaces in comparison to other numbers, and why that is. If we really do the street data collection of having qualitative conversations with some of these people who are leaving the field or who are really struggling in the field, it becomes even more clear to us that, and then the question to me becomes like, how do I cultivate spaces when I feel like I'm already exerting myself, my vulnerability? I have to like highlight and advocate in ways that often are very, very difficult as a person of color who's experienced the trauma and the harm, for students who look like me and students who identify not just like me, but students who are marginalized, right? Like students who are having similar experiences based on their different identity markers, and still feel strong enough to push and advocate at the same time when you're experiencing it too, right? You can't fill from an empty cup sometimes. And it's
Correct.
about also having to like navigate and find different ways to fill your cup so that you can keep going. And that can also be very difficult because it's just such a challenging time, and education changes so fast and has changed so much, particularly post-COVID, for very different reasons. And whatever's happening in the world, I mean, anybody who hasn't watched the documentary 13th just has to watch 13th to see the direct correlation between politicians, presidents, and the history of schools in our country, and how those are not separate things, but are very, very much related. To
Much
understand
relate.
that how politicized and how political our classrooms are really, and how much more difficult it is to navigate if you don't identify as a white male or a white person in general and don't have mainstream. And even those who are white and advocate are nowadays also being penalized for their advocacy. But it's very different when that is your lived experience and you're walking in with this mission. And oftentimes schools are telling you, we're hiring you for this. We're hiring you because of your views and your work and your stance. But when the pushback comes, because anytime you're going to authentically do the work, when the pushback comes, they're not about that work anymore, because what they wanted
Mhm.
was something very performative, and you are not bringing in something performative. You want transformation, you want impact. So yeah, it's a lot. It's so complex. It's so, I mean, I had a leader a couple years ago tell me, your Palestinian identity is offensive. Can you tone it down? And that was pre-genocide. And I just thought to myself, like, this white man who's in charge of curriculum, who has such a wide reach, thinks my Palestinian identity is offensive. Like, how can anybody's identity be offensive? And you have so much power in this space. How does that view impact the kids that you're working with and for and serving? And so my response to him was, your white privilege, your bias is offensive. Can you tone it down? Like, how dare you
Exactly.
like speak to me in this way and make this really divisive comment that's going to harm so many of the kids that we claim to care about, right? And so there's just so many examples that I can think about, like from being called ISIS by a teacher who was serving many kids who look like me, to just a bunch of different things that are born out of ignorance towards who we actually are, and normalized by criminalization and dehumanization, and a lack of a push to humanize our identities in these public spaces, so that we have accepted that this is our status quo and this is how we're going to be perceived and treated, and it's okay by
Mhm.
many, and I will never be okay with it, right? Like, so I will
Mhm.
use my voice, and I keep saying the harder they try to silence me, the louder I'm going to get to really advocate for the things that matter. Because my father passed away, Allah yarhamah,
Mhm.
10 months ago,
Mhm.
and I always say my journey's mapped on his hands. And as a refugee who was born into war, who grew up in a refugee camp, never had the privilege of getting his education, he worked tirelessly to make sure that every single one of his kids did. And I always say that my journey is mapped on his calloused hands, because he was
Mhm.
so proud of the sacrifices that he made that were symbolized on his hands through the calluses of his hands. And so I owe it to my ancestors, religiously and culturally, and just my familial ancestors, to do this work with the privileges that I've been blessed with as an educated person, that if I'm not leveraging and using my tools and my knowledge to change and shift the landscape, then I shouldn't be teaching at all, and that I'm misusing the gifts that I've been given by God. And so, like, those, to me, it feels like a very personal responsibility and not a choice.
Thinking about the privilege, and actually, let's go back a little bit when you're talking about what the man said to you about how your identity was offensive. He's an administrator speaking to another adult. You really, really have to consider the policies that he's going to create and enforce and the policies that he's going to deny and push back on, which ultimately means that his way of thinking is impacting so many children, even for the children who do not have the identities that quote unquote offends him. That means you're not only establishing, but maintaining a foundation of hatred for people who are not just like you. It solidifies it for so many people, which continues the repetition of generations with dehumanizing humans. When you're in a space such as education, like you said, it's political. Same exact scenarios within the library spaces. Same way you don't see a lot of people of color in there. You don't see a lot of Muslims there. Not saying that people of color don't work there, not saying that there are no Muslims, but considering the masses, libraries are 90% middle class Caucasian women. That is a fact of the numbers of who is hired or within the library systems throughout America. When you take that and when you think about those numbers alone, that's not a coincidence. That's not by chance. It's by design. And so when someone does come in there and has like, wait a minute, I thought we're standing on equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. That sounds good in the policies when you read it. That word neutrality, they get to use it to say, oh no, we're not going to have this Palestinian display because we're neutral. No, you are not neutral. What you're doing is using your own personal bias and using a policy to uphold your bias instead of actually standing on what you're saying, because technically there's no accountability. When we think about these spaces that shape society, it's schools and libraries. From your experience, your education, all of that, what advice would you offer to anyone seeking to make a difference through education, literacy, advocacy, leadership, or simply community service?
I think we're living in really scary times, and a lot of people who have historically pushed back against the systems that are intentionally oppressing, silencing, and keeping these narratives out of these different educational spaces are quiet now because they're afraid of the reprimand and repercussion of speaking up. And so I will always tell teachers that within your locus of control, your positionality and your privilege, there's always somewhere that you can push back, right? And even if we are starting somewhere in a classroom where we're allowing students to bring in their own texts, for example, that are representative of something that they can connect to, a cultural identity, a story of a grandmother, like whatever you connect to, bring in your own text. Like, let's cultivate lists with students. And those are oftentimes things that don't need approval by boards that are going to keep what stories make it into a classroom. And let's have students, I used to do in my classroom, read one, write one. I would bring in, I really thought about what voices aren't represented in our curriculum and what voices don't we typically see in our school community. Because to me, being culturally sustaining and really building global citizens means that I have to prepare them for any context, especially with internet and technology today, that they should be able to engage with people, even those that aren't represented in their local and immediate communities. It's really important to me. And so I brought in voices of writers and authors that they would never read otherwise. And the purpose was we did, it was called Read One, Write One. So you read a poem about an experience of a person. So like we read Conversation with a Massage Therapist about a Native American lady going to get a massage, and she's trying to relax and turn off her mind and just enjoy her massage. But the therapist is making all of these assumptions about the fact that she doesn't look like an Indian and what that means. And so the lady who's going to get a massage is like processing this conversation, and it's a dialogical poem. So like you're having a dialogue in a poem format. And so we would read the poem and I would say, okay, now I want you to write your own poem, and either borrow the format or a line or something from this poet in order to write about an experience where you felt similar to this character. And then they would write one. So we read to write, right? Like we consume to create. And by doing so, all of a sudden I have, instead of me deciding what the mirrors for students are, and I don't represent their identities. And even if I did, I don't know their lived experiences. I am
Mhm.
allowing them to cultivate pieces of literature that are theirs with their own voices, that are their lived experience. And I'm no longer the gatekeeper of what that looks like. That's a very simple move, right? Moving our desks to the sides and having no furniture and having circle and really just getting on a ground human level, face to face with our students and face to face, having them face each other to have conversations about the literature that we're reading. And if we're in districts where we have to read white canon texts only, how can we supplement with student voices and student stories in that space? And how can we also ask questions where students are interrogating why that is the curriculum and what's wrong with, like, I think the biggest piece, like my teachers, but I love The Great Gatsby. It's like, okay, great, read it on your own time. Our kids don't, right? Like, go ahead. We can talk about The Great Gatsby, but if we have to teach it, let's talk about why The Great Gatsby is problematic, how it is anti-woman, how it is highlighting a problematic time period with racism and anti-Semitism and all the other things that The Great Gatsby talks about, right? And materialism, and how it was the beginning of a time period that really shifted the American landscape in a lot of ways in the 1920s. Like, let's talk about why and how, to really discuss Great Gatsby in a way that will open students' eyes to see the relationship between the 1920s and what we're seeing today in the world, right? Which is often my scope when teaching canon text, is that we have to, like, really make the connections between what students are experiencing today so that they can see the value in why we have to understand things from a historical standpoint if I have to teach that text. And it's not hard to supplement with other smaller texts like picture books and poems and songs and other things in order to, like, create text sets that will help tell that story. But also, even, like, for example, we did a genocide unit that I often present about, and I just thought to myself that, like, there are so many active genocides happening in the world right now that we don't deem a genocide. So instead of me doing a genocide unit, I did a dehumanization unit. And within the dehumanization unit, I gave students, we read part of Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Message with the Pyramid of Hate, and students were mapping things. We watched Pocahontas because I wanted them to also see how we are, like, conditioned to dehumanize and see BIPOC folks as, like, these flat characters, and how we dehumanize even through storytelling in cartoons and other texts that are focused on children and meant for children, so that they can push back against those as well and see that. And then they chose several different memoirs that they got to choose, 16 different memoirs that represented dehumanization happening internationally now. And they had to do, it was a research slash memoir. And then they had to research. And what I did was I gave them the definition of genocide from the United Nations. And the question was, based on the research and the memoir that you read, determine if what you read was a genocide or not based on this definition. Make a case using research and synthesize your information, then share your information publicly. And instead of students learning about one or two examples of genocide, they got to learn about 16 different examples in a global context.
Mhm.
Things that were very relevant to the students in our classrooms, right? Like, I had Bosnian students, I had Palestinian students, I had students that came from different areas of the world where they could really connect to the conversation and see a through line of dehumanization with every historical erasure of people and stories. And then we started to talk about, like, the first level of the pyramid of hate is name calling. Where are
Yeah.
we seeing name calling in the lunchroom? Where are we seeing name calling in the hallways? Where are we seeing name calling in mainstream media? And how quickly do we go from name calling to genocide, like just watching
Mhm.
things historically? And that was
Yeah.
a huge eye-opener for students who normalized using the N-word in the lunchroom, for example, and now started to think about, like, what that actually meant, that even if I'm saying things in jest, it's the beginning of planting seeds that could ultimately lead to something a lot more serious. And so I have to really be careful about how I communicate, the words that I use, how I view different people, why I view people that way, and really interrogate those things. It was such a powerful unit.
Yes.
I can't tell you how my sophomore students, 10th graders, the reflections that because we do a lot of journaling and reflecting in my class as well, were deeply impacted by those conversations, to the point where I still get emails 3 years later of students who are reflecting and still leaning into the learning from that one unit that we did. And so I think that our classrooms could become very liberatory spaces and critical spaces if we allow them to be that, even in the most restrictive places. When we give up the power and really distribute the power to the students and create flexible learning opportunities where they can read themselves into their own learning, that we don't have to gatekeep anymore. We can still do things with students at the center and not the teacher and what the teacher enjoys reading or what the teacher enjoys doing historically. And that can shift the experiences of so many of our kids across the board.
Yes. The reflection, it means a lot for all of us as individuals, no matter your faith, your culture, your age. Reflection is so important to even recognize your own biases, to be able to recognize someone else's biases in someone else. It doesn't always have to be against you or directly from you. Reflection is just so important that I think it's oftentimes underrated. And we need to do more of that to help the world be a better place. And, to have sophomore students still contacting you is great. However, like I said before, teachers like that, like you, should be the rule and not just the exception. Our educational spaces actually, and we already know they just impact society as a whole. We are preparing the next generation to run the world after us. And what seeds are we planting? The same way you're saying, name calling was the first step. And it's one thing to be able to recognize a genocide in, let's say, a group of people that you identify with. Well, it's another thing to be able to recognize a genocide happening to someone else. We have to be able to see it. And unless we have these spaces and remove the political ideologies and simply discuss reality, until we do that, I think that this problem or these problems will continue to persist. And it's even the primary reason why we have to have conversations like these and do the work that we do. It's just essential, not only for us currently today, but our children, our grandchildren, all the other future generations to come, to be able to offer something better. And just like you're saying, your privilege from the work of your father, that means a lot. It might not look the same, but there's still sacrifices and decisions made to try to improve future generations. Definitely appreciate the work that you're doing and the work that you continue to do.
And just say it's not just seeing it's seeing it and being able to push back against it, right? Like I always lean into Bettina Love, who says we no longer need allies. We need co-conspirators. We need people who are going to roll up the sleeves and
Mhm.
who are going to push back against the status quo, because the fear is what keeps us like, and that's it. Like either you're about the work or you're not, because not being about it or being in this middle space where like I empathize and I understand, but I'm not willing to do anything about it makes you complicit. We're part of the
Yes,
problem when we're not pushing back, because nothing is
definitely.
going to change with our silence regardless of why we're being silent. And I don't say that lightly as someone who doesn't understand the implications and the financial implications and the really deep ways that you can be cut and hurt based on your advocacy. But I will say that that is also what the system wants. They want to scare us away
Mhm.
from work, and when we are scared away from the work, then that is the success of the oppressor and the system doing exactly what it needs to be doing in order to silence certain groups of people. So it's not enough for us to see it. It has to be us seeing it and pushing back against it, even if that feels like it's really small. Like,
Yeah.
again, like building community. If we can build community, I always say one of the reasons when 9/11 happened, we were living across the river in New Jersey and we were scared. Like the Muslim community across the country was very, very scared of pushback because
Yeah.
there were so many threats and things. I know so many women who took off their hijab. But in New York and New Jersey, because we lived in very diverse communities, we didn't feel any pushback. Like you might hear an ignorant comment of
Mhm.
somebody saying, go back to your country or something stupid like that, but
Mhm.
never really felt like violence on us or on our bodies or felt threatened with violence. Whereas in Illinois, where my parents were, my mother had bricks thrown at her window. The Islamic schools had to close for 2 months because they had mobs of people coming to the schools with bats. And that was because of how redlined Illinois is in comparison to just living with across from and next to somebody who is different than you and having like everyday interactions like, hey, how are you? How was your day? Oh my God, your pet's so cute, your child's so cute, our children play together. There's a human connection that just by default, you humanize each other because of these daily interactions where we don't even have to like talk about my religion or my
Mm-hmm.
ethnic background or my ethnic foods. We just need to coexist in a space where we can be in community together, and that works. And so like, how do we leverage school spaces to do the heart work and the healing work where we're simply building community? And that's enough. That is pushing back against a system that aims to silo and create fear between individual groups, when we can dismantle those silos and bring people together on a human level to say, hey, here's I grew up eating makluba, and this is what makluba is, and that's my favorite dish. Like, I don't have to sit here and talk about more kind of, I don't want to say controversial, because there's really nothing controversial about inequity and marginalization and genocide, but like topics that are perceived to be more complex. We just need to exist in a human sphere together, and that will allow those other more contentious topics to flow more easily. And for us to say that I can disagree with you, or I can have a different lived experience than you, and we can still be in harmony and coexist together, as long as that's not contingent on my dehumanization and the harm of my people. Everything else is we can work through, and that often starts with like a small experience that will allow us to just see each other as people, right? And that is such a rare thing, because we've done such a good job as a country and as a nation and as a world to not see people as people. And that makes so much of the harm that we see acceptable, because we don't see them as people to begin with. And so, yeah, I just feel like people need to figure out what the sweet spot is within their locus of control and the gifts that they harbor, because everybody has gifts, to see how. And that's one of the things I do with my students, is defining activism. Oftentimes people think activism is being in Capitol Hill and protesting. It's not. Activism is recognizing oppression and pushing back against it. And that could be by reclaiming a story. It could be by creating a piece of art that tells a story that's not the mainstream story, by empowering somebody who historically hasn't had the power to see themselves in an asset mindset, to see themselves in that way. Like, those are all ways that we can push back against the system, one human, one classroom, one community at a time. And with time, those impacts will have long-term impacts, because at the end of the day, we're going to get old, and these babies in our classrooms are going to take over. And every single person in a classroom needs to be asking themselves, who do I want to take care of me when I'm older? What kind of a doctor do I want? What kind of a senator do I want? What kind of a police officer do I want when I'm older? Because those are the people in your classrooms right now. And when we answer that question, we really need to think about what we're looking to cultivate as a future for ourselves.
It is so great getting your perspective on all of this. It's just so pertinent to what is going on in our lives in this very moment. It's just a reality. We have to talk about it. We have to push back, like we said, against what is happening, and to help ourselves currently and in the future. This is part of what the Islamic Library Association does. It's allowing Muslims to have a space within the settings that contribute to perspectives within society. And your work is just phenomenal. And Dr. Jaber, thank you so, so much for joining me today, and for your continued commitment to education, equity, pushback, and creating those spaces where students and communities can thrive. This conversation reminds us that representation, belonging, and access are not simply educational goals, they are essential to helping individuals see their value, recognize their potential, and participate fully in their communities. Thank you all so much for joining us in this conversation through the Islamic Library Association's educational interview series. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Dr. Harris-Shahid. This was an amazing conversation, and I knew it was going to be, just because our little precursor conversation before this was just as dynamic. So I appreciate you for including me in your space.
Oh, alhamdulillah. And I look forward to speaking to you soon, inshallah.
Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Join the Islamic Library Association, and together we can shape a more inclusive future for literature.